Hey, what's up, guys? It's Jordan with the Laundromat Resource Podcast. This is show 167, and it's a doozy. So I'm pumped you're here today because we have Kiera Hamilton on the show today. And listen, I'm just going to put this one down as an instant classic. So much good stuff. I mean, Keira is awesome. She has a ton of knowledge. She's very well spoken, and she shares a ton of very practical, specific things today. So this is one of those episodes where you're probably going to want to take some notes. You've been warned. So we're going to jump into that. But real quick, today's fast lane tip is... Did you know we have a ton of free resources, downloadable stuff, very practical, tangible things that can help you buy your first laundromat or run your laundromat? You can go to the resources tab on the menu and go to guides and worksheets and all the other resources that are in there too, and check those out. There to go download for free. Some of them you do need to be signed into the free account, but listen, go join the community, sign into the free account, be a part of the community, get involved here, and that is going to help you on your way achieving your goals. That's the goal, right? Achieve your goals. So go check those out. And real quick, just quick favor, if you've been listening to this podcast for a little while, I would love it if you'd go to whatever platform you're listening on, Apple, Spotify, wherever, or if you're watching on YouTube, hit the like and subscribe, maybe leave a comment, tell Keira how great she is. But if you're on a podcasting platform, I would love for you to just do a quick rating and review. Helps it helps me provide a better show, and we're trying out some new things kind of coming up, and I'd love to hear how you like them or don't like them. But if you don't like them, man, let me know first before you leave a bad review. But if you do like the show, you get some value out of this, you're thankful for the guests that come on, and you can endure me, then I would love for you to just give us a quick rating and review on there. That helps us out a ton. Appreciate it. But without further ado, let's jump into it. Kiera Hamilton. Hey, Kiera, how's it going?
Hey, Jordan, I'm doing well. How are you?
I am doing awesome. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I'm super excited. Actually, we were just chatting right before we hit record, and I got even more excited about this episode. So appreciate you taking the time, coming on, sharing your story, and sharing some of what you're doing, and sharing some of your wisdom. So why don't we start with this? Who are you?
Yeah, well, first off, thanks so much for having me on. I love talking about laundromats and buying businesses, so I'm really looking forward to this conversation. My name is Kiera Hamilton. I am a former educator. I taught high school English in the Bay Area for 5 years. And through some unexpected career moves, I am now a laundromat owner and an SBA loan broker, which means I help people get financing to buy businesses.
That's awesome. Well, I mean, it seems expected to me to go from high school English teacher to laundromat owner. That's a natural.
It totally makes sense. Yeah, it actually does totally make sense when, I explain it. But if you just look at my LinkedIn profile, it seems a little random. A lot of people are like, how'd you get to where you are today?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's one of the reasons I started this podcast episode, because I'm like, this is a weird business that we're in over here. How did everybody get into this thing? So I was like, I got to find out more and talk to some people. So how did you get into, what is the weird, but not that weird path to laundromat ownership?
Oh my gosh, great question. I'll give the somewhat abbreviated version because it is a long journey with struggle and success and everything in between. But basically, I decided in 2019, actually before COVID hit, I decided in February of 2020 that I wanted to leave the teaching profession. I had been teaching for 5 years, and there was so much that I loved about it, but ultimately it just wasn't the right fit for me anymore. So without a plan of what I was going to do next, I left the classroom, spent about a year trying to figure out what that next thing was, kind of randomly ended up working in commercial real estate. I worked as a property manager, managing Class A office buildings in San Francisco for a couple years. And that was really interesting work. I actually really liked it. It exposed me to a lot of business skills that I didn't have. I was, working with budgets of millions of dollars. I was managing engineering and janitorial teams. I was using Excel, which I had previously been intimidated by. It just gave me more confidence with finance and business in general because I don't have a business background. My master's is in education. So I really kind of learned a lot about business from that job. And there was a lot that was great about that job, but I also had this feeling that I wanted to do something that was mine. I wanted to be more in the driver's seat, and I didn't quite know what that was going to look like yet. I come from a background where when I was younger, I didn't think of businesses as things to be bought and sold. That concept just didn't really occur to me. I didn't think of buying a business as a career move. But my husband and I have done a little bit of real estate investing. We bought a 4-unit building in the Bay Area in December of 2021. And a couple years into my career as a property manager, we were looking to make another investment. And we were initially thinking about investing in more real estate because it was something we had done. We had a fairly good understanding of how it worked, and it made sense if we'd done it before to do it again. But at the time that we were looking, it was really hard to find something that was going to cash flow and that just made sense for us. Because I had worked as a property manager, I was pretty confident in my property management skills, but a lot of the places we could afford at the time were out of state. And I felt hesitant about putting a property in the hands of a manager that I didn't know well. And, I had seen through managing our property that there are issues that come up, right? Even real estate is not completely passive income. And I just wasn't totally comfortable with an investment in Ohio that I wouldn't be able to drive over and fix a problem for. So there are a number of reasons real estate didn't seem like the right move. And in retrospect, I'm really glad that we didn't invest in more real estate. I can get more into that later. But we started looking at other investment opportunities, and my husband was really the one driving it. And he was kind of looking at what I call the gateway drugs of business acquisition, like ATM routes and vending machine routes. I feel like that's where a lot of people start because they are, I wouldn't say passive income. I really don't think there's such a thing as passive income in business acquisition, but they're a little lower lift to get started. Typically, the startup costs are lower. So we were looking at things like that. And then we kind of moved from there into laundromats. I will say too, I love the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once. Have you seen that one, Jordan?
Yeah.
Okay, so then there's a laundromat in that one. I loved that movie. And when we left the theater, I looked at my husband and I was like, I want to own a laundromat one day. And this was a couple years before we bought one. So it was just like this silly dream, this joke that I had at the time. But it kind of planted this idea, this sort of like romantic notion of owning a laundromat. So we were looking at, it started as how can we invest our money? We were thinking about real estate. That didn't work out. So we kind of moved into business, and specifically businesses that wouldn't require us to be there every day, and businesses that we felt confident running. Neither of us have a background in business. Laundromats are pretty straightforward. It's just laundry, right? And I'm not saying there's not complexity to them. There certainly can be complexity and there are problems. But as far as first-time business owners, that made sense to us. And so we bought it in May of 2023, and I became the primary operator. And here we are.
I love it. Okay, well, we've got a lot to unpack here. So going from teacher to laundromat owner is quite the jump. And Nick, who was on the podcast not that long ago, did the same thing and hasn't looked back, loves it, and loves kind of all of it. So not unheard of, but not super common either.
Yeah.
As you guys were looking, I mean, you said your husband is starting with the gateway. I love that because I think that is totally true. Vending and ATM routes, and even a little bit the water dispensing stores. I see
sure.
that a lot
Yeah.
too. So definitely, I love that being the gateway. And a lot of people kind of, even before they get in there, right, just kind of like you guys, end up going to, a little bit bigger, like a laundromat, right? Where you're at one location and you're running a business there. What was it that kind of prompted that transition from, your gateway drugs up to the full-fledged addict over here that you are now today? Why start looking at laundromats? Was it because the potential was bigger, or what was it that attracted you?
Yeah. Are you asking how did we move from thinking about things like ATM routes and vending machines to laundromats?
That's better of a way to put it than I put it. So yes, thank
you. That's a good question. I do think that there was something that appealed to us about having an actual location. And it was interesting because for a while, we didn't want that. We were like, we don't want to have a brick and mortar business with a physical location that we're responsible for. But I think the more that I thought about it and the more that I learned about laundromats, you mentioned, teachers and kind of how it might seem unexpected on paper, but you've heard of teachers, buying businesses or laundromats before. And there was a lot that I loved about teaching. One thing that I loved, and I didn't think of it in these terms at the time, but I think of it this way now, is I loved being an operator. I loved running the show. Like, I love to be in charge, and not just because I want to be bossy, but because I love creating experiences for people. I loved creating lessons, creating units, finding creative ways for students to connect with material. I really liked running the show. I worked at a summer camp too. I was like a, team leader in groups of kids. And I loved that too. Like, I love being the one to facilitate experiences for people. And that's what being a business owner is, right? You're an operator. And I think there actually is so much from my education background that I bring to being a business owner. I mean, you got to have people skills, because no matter where your laundromat is, at some point you're going to have to deal with a difficult person or, someone upset. And I can tell you, any difficult person I've dealt with at my laundromat has nothing on 14-year-olds when they're cranky, I've had my fair share of time dealing with difficult people, right? So you have to have people skills. You have to be very organized. I mean, I mentioned in our pre-chat, I've got a 9-tab operations manual that breaks down every part of our business. And it's been really key in training new employees and just keeping myself organized. And, those were skills I developed as a teacher. So I think I actually found that, compared to, say, an ATM route or a vending machine route, which I've never owned one of those, so I can't really speak personally to what that's like. But this is just kind of, I think, to answer your question, like, how did we get to laundromat over these other things? I think I actually did want something that would be, to a degree, hands-on. I didn't want something where I would need to be there every day, so I did end up leaving my job, and I can talk more about that because I know that's a decision, people weigh. But I did end up leaving my job as a property manager before we bought our laundromat. And I was also brokering SBA loans. So I knew that the laundromat wasn't going to be the only work that I did. I would also have this other business. So I wanted something that didn't demand me being there every day, but I also kind of wanted something that did need me a little bit. Like, I wanted something that I could put my creativity into, that I could interact with customers, that I could really kind of like get hands on and get some real business skills. So a laundromat felt like an appropriate kind of point on that spectrum. And again, I don't think laundromats are passive income, but I do think there's a spectrum of, like, you have some businesses that are more hands-off and some businesses that are more hands-on for the owner. And that can depend on a lot of factors. And this particular laundromat, because every laundromat is different, as you know, really hit this sweet spot of, in a typical week, I put in 7 to 10 hours of work, either being in the laundromat or working on it remotely. So it has allowed me to really build up a lot of skills in the last year, but it's also allowed me to pursue other things. I also broker SBA loans. I also compete in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. And those were things that, with a full-time job, like a typical 9 to 5, are a lot harder to do. And so the laundromat gave me the opportunity to build these skills and do other things.
Yeah. Okay. Well, now that I know I'm talking to somebody dangerous, I'm going to watch out.
Well, yeah, watch out.
Yeah. I don't want to get put in some sort of submission and
definitely not
regret my life decisions. Okay. Well, I mean, would you mind talking about, because, there's a lot of people listening who trying to do exactly what you did, right? Which is leave your job and own a business, right? It's particularly a laundromat. So can you talk about like how you made that decision to make that transition? What gave you the courage to do that? Because that's hard, right? So many people are afraid to do that, which is totally understandable because it's scary, right? So how did you decide to do that? And how did you have the courage to do that?
Oh, I love that question, Jordan. I was actually just speaking with someone earlier today about this. So I've now made a couple career changes. I'm 31, and I think it's more common with my generation, right? We don't necessarily work at a company for 20 or 30 years like our parents' generation did. And I'll say my first career change when I left teaching was so scary. It was really hard to make that decision because, I mean, I'm still paying off loans from grad school. I had devoted a lot of time, energy, and money to that path, and I'd planned on doing it a lot longer. I mean, my grandma was a principal, my mom is a teacher. Ever since I was in high school, I had this idea that this is what I want to do with my life. And it was hard for a lot of reasons. I think one of the biggest reasons it was challenging was so much of my identity was in being a teacher, right? And in I really liked that I felt like I was doing something positive being a teacher. I felt like, the time I was putting into it didn't always, feel like it had an immediate impact, but I was like, education is something that's good for the world. And so I really identified with being a teacher. And when I made the decision to leave, it was a year basically from the first time I applied for a job to when I got into my next position in property management. And that was one of the hardest years I've been through because I faced so much uncertainty. And it was just a tough time in the job market. I mean, so many places were pausing hiring. There's just a lot of uncertainty. And I think I really built some mental muscle during that time in dealing with uncertainty. And it was very difficult. I mean, every day I was like, oh my gosh, what career path am I going to get into? When is it going to happen? It felt like that period of uncertainty was never going to end. So I do think, going through that made my next career transition when I left property management and got into SBA loan brokering and bought a business. I was like, oh, I've already been through this before, right? I've already made a career change. Something that made it a lot easier the second time was I learned that I don't have to personally identify as strongly with my work. And some people do, and that's great. I just found that I gave so much of myself emotionally to teaching. I was so attached to it. I was so attached to it as an identity. It didn't leave a lot of room for other things. Like I mentioned, I do jujitsu, and I started that during that year of being unemployed and figuring stuff out. I don't think I would have ever picked up jujitsu as an activity when I was teaching, because teaching is hard enough. I don't really want to go to the gym and get my ass kicked for an hour, that takes a lot of energy. And so kind of releasing myself from needing to find my identity through my work opened me up to a whole lot of other possibilities of what to do with my time. And there was also just a perspective shift on business. I'm not someone who has traditionally been attracted to business, I will say, because I viewed business as, oh, people are just trying to make as much money as possible. And that is the case for some business owners, but many business owners, that's not the case. And I really like owning a business because I think that it can be an opportunity to make a positive impact on your employees, on your customers. So I've given you a very long answer, Jordan, and I'm forgetting now what your original question was.
No, it was great. And you actually answered it despite not even knowing what it was. So kudos to you for that. That was it was really skillful. But I was asking you, what gave you the courage and helped you do that?
Oh,
one of the things
yes.
I love about what you said in there is, that the first time you made that career change, it was super scary. And the second time was a lot less scary. And one of the things that I learned too is so many people are afraid, and like I said, rightfully so, to make a big change, whether it's a career change, buy a business, ask the girl out, whatever the change is, right? You're afraid to do it. And I've been afraid to do it. And and it stops you. Like you're saying, a lot of that has to do with uncertainty and a lack of confidence. However, you don't develop those things unless you actually take the step and do it, and you learn and you grow, right? And we can't grow if we're not kind of taking those steps. Now, obviously, we want to do it as smartly as we can and make the best decisions we can. But at some point, you just got to jump. You just got to make the decision and do it. Bet on yourself. Like, believe in yourself that, hey, I'm making a career change. I don't really know how this is going to go. I don't have much experience in property management, but I'm going to go do it. I'm going to go give it a shot, right? And see what happens. And then after you did that, you had more information about actually making that change and also about yourself, which gives you more confidence to make another change if and when that time comes. I just love that, because you can't develop self-confidence. You can't develop courage without doing scary things and hard things.
Absolutely. I mean, at every kind of big point in my life where there was some big transition or transaction, leaving teaching, buying our first home, selling our first home, buying another property, making another career change, buying a business, I will say I've never had 100% certainty that it was going to work out. And how can you, if something hasn't happened yet, like how can you have 100% confidence that you're going to be great at running this laundromat and it's going to be the perfect investment? The truth is that you can't, because you just don't know the future. The future is by definition uncertain, right? And I think what I've gotten better at over time is not necessarily reducing uncertainty. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying don't do your due diligence, right? I tend to be on the overanalyzing, overthinking side of things. And so this advice may not be great for everyone. If you're like on the opposite end of that spectrum, maybe you need to think about things more. But I tend to be the type of person who's like, okay, I've already asked every question I can think of. What else do I need to ask? Like, how can I get myself to a point where I feel 100% confident? And I've just learned that's not going to happen, because that's just kind of the nature of making big decisions. I think what's changed for me is I've gotten more comfortable with that. I've gotten more comfortable saying, you know what? I'm not 100% certain this laundromat thing is going to go great. I've done all the due diligence that I can. I do feel pretty confident based on the research I've done and based on my skill set. You know, I'm not making this decision frivolously, but I accept that there are unknowns. There are going to be things that happen that I'm not expecting. And there have been. There are going to be challenges that are hard, but I do believe in myself. And I think where I'm at in my life, this makes sense to do, and I'm going to go ahead and do it. And, you know, to your point, a lot of people don't move forward with things because of that. I talk to people who are like, yeah, you know, I've been thinking about buying a laundromat for 5 years, and, you know, they tell other friends about it, and it kind of just always lives as this dream. And I think at some point you have to start moving forward. And even if you move forward and you make the quote unquote wrong decision, however you want to define that, hey, at least you know this path, I don't want to keep going down this. Exit off on the map, try a different direction. But if you always stay in one place, you're never going to know where on the map you do or don't want to go.
Yeah, I mean, I could not agree with you more on that. Like that, and obviously, like, I hear that all the time too. Like, I've been wanting to buy a laundromat for decades, and you're like, well, why haven't you? Well, I mean, you've got to take the action. And, you know, listen, you know, a lot of people probably don't know my story, but when I bought my first laundromat, it went horribly. I lost a ton of money. And I talk about this all the time. I've gone into a lot of detail about it. I lost episode 1 of the podcast. If you haven't heard it yet, go, if you want to. Misery loves company kind of thing. It's a miserable story because I lost a lot of money and made a lot of mistakes and all of that. But man, I learned a ton, for one. I grew a ton, for two. And I'm like a decade down the line now, and I'm like, man, despite how awful it all felt like it was going, and how like much of a failure I felt like, and I look back on the last 10 years and I'm like, man, it's been pretty good considering, you know, like I feel pretty good about where I'm at right now, despite having gone through all that, and probably more to the point because I went through all of that. So, you know, if anybody's out there listening who's afraid to take some action, to make a move, something like that, you know, hopefully you can take some solace in both of our stories here, where, you know, sometimes you just got to take a leap. And on a long enough time horizon, tends to work out if you don't quit.
Absolutely. I mean, I mentioned that year where I was unemployed and figuring out my next move. That was one of the hardest years. I was like legitimately depressed at certain points during that. But looking back, I think if it had been easier, like if I had just gotten another job immediately out of teaching, there would have been so many lessons I would have missed out on. And I don't know if I would have ended up where I am today. I, could have had some other great path, but like I'm so enthusiastic about where my life is right now. And I do attribute a lot of that to the lessons I learned during that really tough time.
Yeah, exactly. Awesome. Okay. I want to actually, this is unconventional for the episode, but I want to actually pause for a second. I just want to mention, number one, that you have a podcast, right?
Yes, I do.
What is the name of said podcast?
Yeah, so it's called So You Want to Buy a Business, and it's focused on ETA, which is entrepreneurship through acquisition, which just means buying businesses.
Yeah, awesome. So I wanted to point that out. So go check out that podcast and also your YouTube channel, which is Kiera_Hamilton.
Yep.
On YouTube, and also LinkedIn. We'll get to that again at the end. But LinkedIn over there where you can connect with Keira also. Listen, Keira does SBA loans. So if you're looking for an SBA loan, connect up with Keira. Okay. Commercial over. I don't really throw commercials in here very often, but there you go.
I appreciate it.
I just wanted to make sure everybody heard about that because that's pretty cool. I'm excited about your podcast.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So going back to it, did you decide, okay, we want to buy a laundromat, or did you come across a laundromat in your search for a generic business? And how did that whole thing come about, and how did you end up finding the laundromat that you bought?
Yeah, kind of a funny story. So I don't remember exactly. I think by the time we found our laundromat, we were looking at laundromats specifically. And we looked at a number, and a lot of them we said no to simply because of the neighborhood that they were in. So we live in Oakland, which is across the bay from San Francisco. And there were a lot of laundromats in the East Bay where I was just like, if there's a problem at 9 p.m., am I going to be comfortable going over to that laundromat to fix it? And if the answer was no, then we didn't buy it. Because I think that, you can face a lot of problems based on the neighborhood and just based on your comfort level with being there, right? Mm-hmm. So our search was geographically constrained, and then it was also, of course, constrained to what we could afford. I think we found the listing either on Biz by Seller, BizQuest. And the reason I say it's funny is because, man, okay, I want to say up front, I know there are good business brokers out there. I have worked with them. There are business brokers who do a good job. So I don't mean to.
We keep it real over here. I am a laundromat broker, so I feel like I can just slam us over here because there are so many bad ones for sure. There are a lot of business brokers who are tough to work with. So what had happened was we had found the laundromat we ended up purchasing, and we had called the broker and just happened to get him on the phone and learn the name of the laundromat. And then from there, he ghosted us. Multiple calls, texts, emails, all that stuff. So, whatever, a week goes by and we're like, we are going to lose this business. So we just reach out to the business directly, asked to speak to the owner, and started the conversation that way. If we hadn't gotten the name of our laundromat from the broker, there's a really good chance we would have never bought this laundromat because obviously, listings are anonymous. So we would have just been like calling random laundromats in San Francisco. So we did end up with just a certain amount of luck because I think it was only like 2 months from when we decided, hey, we want to buy a laundromat to when we ended up actually submitting an offer, which, there's just some luck involved there. So yeah, we found it online. We got lucky with the broker situation, and happy to go into whatever details from there would be interesting to discuss. Yeah. Well, I'm pretty sure I know who the broker was that you were working with.
A lot of people do. Yeah.
Yeah. Which is funny. But no, I mean, that's kind of the thing, right? So like I have a lot of consulting clients right now who, we're trying to find laundromats for them. And I've got a couple where they just found them like within the first month or two. They just found the right one, got an offer accepted, bam, there you go. But there's, a lot of people, not just consulting clients, but a lot of people are just having a hard time finding those deals. And part of it just kind of goes down to, number one, are you doing the things you need to do to find one? And when did you buy this one?
In May 2023 is when we closed.
Okay. So yeah, a little over a year ago. And now in today's market, at least right now, in a lot of markets around the country, you can't only rely on solely just looking, through bizjungle.com or whatever the biz site. Right. They're all BizQuest, BizBuy, BizBin, all biz everything. You can't rely solely on that a lot of times. Or if you do, it's just going to take a long time and you got to be a little more proactive. But the real question is, and I'm asking for a bunch of people out there right now, how did you get the broker on the phone the first time? So many people are like, I can't get a broker to call me back or email me back or anything.
I really wish there were some hot tip I could offer there, Jordan. Yeah. We just called him and happened to get him on the phone, But I will say, just generally, I do know that brokers get a ton of calls, and there are a lot of tire kickers out there. There are people who have been thinking about buying a laundromat for 5 years and they're curious. And the truth is, they're not going to do it. And brokers know that. So I do think you do need to differentiate yourself in some way. Yep. You need to be willing to show proof of funds if that's what someone is asking for. It would be really helpful to have an SBA personal financial statement filled out if you do plan to use SBA financing. I think
something you could help with.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely.
Softball I was talking about.
Yeah.
So I think on LinkedIn, is that
Kiera Hamilton on LinkedIn? Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
So I think you do need to go into conversations prepared, and I think you need to show that you have a realistic understanding of what it's like to own a laundromat. And that's hard to really get before you've bought one. But I think doing your research is important because, if I were a broker and someone called me and they'd never owned a business before and they had a full-time job and they were like, I have a full-time job, I'm looking for a source of passive income, I want to buy a laundromat. That's red flags to me, right? Because one, laundromats are not passive income. They do require, I would say the amount of work varies depending on if it's full serve or self-serve, right? And you can run a laundromat with a full-time job. I'm sure you've had people on this podcast, but it requires a lot of thought. It requires thinking through, how am I going to respond to problems? And so you need to show that you've thought about that stuff when you call a broker. I think you need to show okay, I have an understanding of the types of questions to ask, which I can get into more. And I'm serious about this. This is the amount of capital that I have. This is how much time a week I have to put into this project. This is a little bit about my background. So just understand, brokers get a ton of calls and a lot of those people aren't serious. So you do need to differentiate yourself somehow.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's great advice there for sure. And, just filter it through. Brokers only get paid when deals go through. So you need to convince a broker you can make a deal go through. You've got the knowledge, you've got the capital lined up. Doesn't always have to be your capital, but you've got to have capital lined up, and you have got to have the ability to make a decision and follow through with it. And if you can convince a broker of those things, you're more likely, I won't say you're super likely, but you're more likely to get a call back there. The other thing I'll say too is, listen, I know you're a good person and you're coming from a good place. I will say not every broker would say, oh, red flag, I don't know if this is going to be a good fit for you. Because I've seen what I've called brokers who set up what I call laundry mills. And that's basically where a broker will sell a laundromat to somebody having a pretty good idea that they're not going to succeed. So then in a year or two, they get to sell that laundromat again. And I've seen that happen multiple times. So just something to kind of be aware of. And I hate that, obviously. And I hate that happens, but it does. So don't, I guess my one piece of advice here would be, if it's your first time buying a laundromat, especially, just don't do it alone. Find another owner, get on the forums, get on the Facebook groups, whatever you got to do, hire a consultant, whatever, help you go through that project. Have an SBA lender who has knowledge in the business, something to help you kind of go through that. So you know what you're walking into.
Yeah. I mean, I hadn't heard of that specifically, brokers doing that, because that just seems, I don't know, that doesn't seem ethical to me. I also really don't like that. And, you know, one of the reasons I started making content about laundromats is because I do think there is misinformation online about what it's actually like to own a laundromat. And I think people are trying to sell courses, people are trying to sell laundromats, and I do see this notion of laundromats as passive income. And I think people get really excited about that. And honestly, I understand why. Like, so many people are working jobs that they don't like. They're being underpaid. They're just looking for some way to better themselves, better their family, get ahead, create generational wealth. I don't fault people for wanting to look for passive income strategies, but I just don't think that's the reality with laundromats. And I want to be part of explaining to people what it's actually like. I still think they're great investments. And when you look at the number of hours that you need to put into a laundromat potentially compared to other businesses, I think like you're making a lot more per hour than some other businesses, right? But there are problems. There are problems with any business. And I think, you know, we can go more into this later with due diligence, but I think if a broker or a seller is not willing to tell you what the problems of the business are, because there are always going to be problems, that's a huge red flag.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with all of that, really. Everything that you said. So, okay. So you found this on BizQuest or whatever.
One of the business.
Yep. Yeah. And you ended up, going, straight to the seller and all that stuff, but you got it done. Can I ask, like, how much did you buy it for?
Yeah, definitely. We bought it for $190,000 and we financed it with a loan from a family member. So the sellers were only taking cash offers. So we do have a loan. It's, we've got favorable family rate and terms on it, but we use that in order to make a cash offer.
Yeah, which is great. I mean, I do a webinar almost every week, and one of the questions I get asked about a lot is financing, right? And one of the best sources of potentially, depending on the situation, right? But one of the best potential sources of private money would be loans from family and friends. And in certain cases, they can even lend out retirement funds in their retirement accounts. Go through a professional if you're going to go that route. But there's a lot more money out there than you think. And so there's lots of different ways to finance these things.
Definitely.
That's awesome. Okay. So you bought it. Take us to day one. How were you feeling? Were things like what you expected in terms of what it was like to actually now have all the bucket full of keys that you get, or like numbers wise, was that what you expected? All that. Tell us about right when you first opened or took over.
So when we closed on the business, I was there every day for 14 days straight. I was there, from morning until evening, because I really wanted to understand how the business operated. Now, since then, in a typical week, I'm not there every day. I think I mentioned I typically spend 7 to 10 hours a week, either physically there or working on it remotely. But in the beginning, and this is why when I talk to a lot of people who want to buy laundromats, and some of them have full-time jobs and they want to keep their job, which I do think there's a way to make that work. There are people who do that. But I tell them, I was there 14 days straight. I'm glad that I left my 9-to-5 job, because it just ended up being a better situation for me. But I think in the beginning, it's really important to understand how the business runs so that you can run it more remotely later. Like, I think if I didn't have this really strong base of understanding operations, I wouldn't be able to run it in the way that I run it now. So I would say that, there was nothing glaring where I was like, oh, this is completely outside of what I was expecting. It was basically what I was expecting, but part of what I was expecting is that there were going to be unexpected things that came up. And because I went in with that mindset, when unexpected things came up, I wasn't shocked by it, But like, one challenge we had was, it was either 1 or 2 days after we closed. I'm driving across the bridge into the city and I get a call from the sellers who are going to be training me that day. And they're like, the employee just put in her notice. I was like, oh my gosh, there's one main employee. And we really had wanted to keep her. She had been doing a great job, but she put in her notice. And so, immediately I was putting up an ad on Craigslist, interviewing people. We ended up finding someone fantastic. But that meant that I really needed to learn the operations. And I think this is just really the truth when you have a small business is there are not a lot of layers between you as the owner and your labor force, right? It's like us, and then we have 2 employees. And so I think that's something that people really need to understand, particularly if there's a wash and fold component. If there's not that, like you might still have an attendant, but that changes things a little bit because, if an employee calls out sick, I really care about my orders still getting done on time, getting done in a quality manner. I don't think that the service I'm providing should change because of an employee issue, right? Like people are still paying for the service. They're expecting to get a certain thing. I want to provide that. So, there are days when I've just completely rearranged my schedule because I needed to go in and cover for someone. Like I mentioned in our pre-chat, we actually had another podcast day we were planning to record. And that day I had an employee call in sick and I was like, emailing you 5 minutes before, hey, I got to go into my laundromat. And that's just the reality. I've canceled plans with friends. I've put off trips because you do need to be present to a certain degree with the laundromat. So in the beginning, I was there a lot physically. And honestly, it did feel a little overwhelming at times. And I had to tell myself, I was like, Kiera, like you're highly educated. This is just laundry. You can figure it out. Like you were a teacher and I think that's one of the hardest jobs, right? I was like, you managed 40, 14-year-olds at a time. You can figure out this laundromat. But, I just say that so that if there are people out there who like have bought a laundromat and felt overwhelmed in the beginning, you're not alone. It can be a lot to learn, just learning like, I knew how to fold clothes, but I didn't know how to fold clothes well, right? So I was like learning how to do that. I was learning how the changers worked, learning how the machines worked, really getting to know the operations as they were. And I did plan on making changes in the future, but it was really important for me to understand what the sellers had been doing and be consistent with that. Like I don't think I made any real noticeable changes for at least a month because I was like, there's a reason I bought this business, right? There's a lot of stuff I liked about it. I want to understand what they were doing and why they were doing it. And I want to do it long enough that when I make a change, I have a good reason for it. I don't want to just come in and start making changes immediately before I understand why their current procedures were in place. So yeah, that's what it was like in the beginning.
Yeah. I totally get the overwhelming feeling. It was when I bought my first one, it was like simultaneously overwhelming and underwhelming all at the same time. Actually, honestly, I'm just thinking about this right now. Like it was kind of like having a baby. Yeah. You had a baby. It was like super overwhelming. I was like, who is letting me drive this baby home unsupervised with no instructions whatsoever right now? Mm-hmm. Right. Like, and then you're like, well, actually babies are kind of boring. They just mostly sleep and eat. And like, that's pretty much all they do for a little while. But it's still overwhelming for some reason. And having a laundromat was kind of similar where I was like, who is letting me operate this thing and be in charge of the laundry, like the place that this community does laundry. But also I don't really know what to do. Like, what do I do? People are just doing their own laundry. Like, what do I do? So I totally get that. When you bought it, was it, did it have like a drop off? Was it self-serve? What was the sort of the business model that you bought into?
Yeah. So the sellers we bought it from had owned it for less than a year, and they had bought it. Basically, it was a zombie mat. I don't know all the details, but I think they actually bought it from the landlord. Like I think it had been abandoned. And so they renamed it, got a new Yelp page up, all that, put some new machines in, and then added a wash and fold service. So when we came in, wash and fold service was already there. They were using Sense, for their pickup and delivery. It integrates with Uber and DoorDash to do that. So the infrastructure was really already there. And I think really what we've done in the last year, we have grown it mostly through, I think, customer retention and through raising prices. But I think really what I've focused on is operational efficiency. Like there was no 9-tab Excel sheet that the previous owners passed off to us. A lot of stuff was like, writing stuff on a piece of paper and text messages sort of thing. So yeah, that infrastructure was already there.
Yeah. What do you have any idea, or do you have any sense of, like, for the business, how much was self-serve versus, wash and fold?
Yeah, I don't remember off the top of my head what it was like when we bought it. I would guess the breakdown was similar to what it is now, where about 50% of our revenue is from self-serve, about 50% from wash and fold and dry cleaning. And out of that, about 75% is verifiable through card payments. So only about 20% of our revenue is in cash. And I think that's, significant because I do think that this is changing over time, but traditionally laundromats are cash businesses, right? And that can end up being challenging when you go to buy a laundromat. And it really depends on the sellers. I mean, unfortunately, a lot of owners don't prepare to sell. And, the biggest issue I'm sure you're aware of people run into is you're underreporting cash on your tax returns. So then you're trying to sell it and you're going, hey, I want to value this based off the P&L. But you look at the tax returns and it doesn't match. And if you're trying to get an SBA loan, that's a problem, right? And even if you're not, I would still be skeptical if I were working with a seller who is working that way. Ever since we've bought our laundromat, we're going to sell eventually. I don't know exactly when, and I didn't know when we bought it, but I always have approached it from the perspective that one day I'm going to sell. I've kept very clean records. I report every cash dollar that we make on our tax returns. One, I think that's the right thing to do. But two, I think you should always be thinking ahead to a sale so that you don't get caught in a situation where you want to sell and it's hard to because you've made some poor decisions with your record keeping. So I do think over time, laundromat acquisition hopefully will get easier and smoother because we are seeing the rise of card payments and more revenue can be verified. But yeah, to answer your question, that's the breakdown of the revenue.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I've been saying owners are leaving money on the table left and right by skimming. It's like tripping over dollars to pick up nickels or whatever.
Yeah.
The saying is, I always butcher all the sayings, but, trying to skim off the top. But, the reality of it is, in my view, at least, is that there's plenty of legal tax advantages for owning a business like a laundromat that you don't really need to skim off the top. So I love that you're doing that. And I think more people are doing that and seeing the value in that. And I think, even though, the majority of laundromats are still coin based, more and more are becoming some sort of digital payment system that's more trackable, verifiable, and should, like you said, be making things easier for just going forward to verify how businesses are doing, which can be a challenge. Okay. So you kind of bought this thing. How did you come up with you've mentioned a couple times now, and I'm going to put you on the spot here in a second, but you've mentioned your 9-tab manual. How did you come up with that? And then maybe if you're willing, could you share what the actual 9 tabs, you don't have to go into a whole lot of detail on all of it, but like what they actually are?
Yeah, totally. So how did I come up with it? I think it probably started, I definitely didn't have it from the beginning, but I think it started because we have had a few employees over time, and that you can make different decisions about how to hire people, right? The approach that I have taken is I would rather have a really high quality employee for 6 months and then train someone new than have someone who's not as good of a fit for a longer period of time. So for example, one of the last employees we had, he was here for about 7 months. He was a college grad, was kind of in between his next career move and grad school. And so this was a great place for him to work. He was overqualified to work at a laundromat, but it was a good fit for where he was at this point in his life. And people can make different decisions with hiring. That's just what I've decided to do. So I think it was probably when I was training a new employee that I was like, okay, I want to have a breakdown of how our wash and fold system works. And I think this just comes from my experience as a teacher. People learn in different ways. So I want to show them how to do it. I want them to hear verbally. And then I also want them to have something to refer back to for when I'm not there. If they're like, oh, wait, what did Keira say about this? Let me look at the spreadsheet tab. If I still have a question, then I'll reach out to her. It also became a way for me to communicate with employees. So I'll just pull it up and explain to you what the tabs are. So the first tab is the team updates tab. And the reason I have this is because I really don't want to be texting employees when they're not at work, unless it's like a schedule, like, can you work Saturday sort of thing, right? So I created this team updates tab so that even if I'm out of the house or something and I'm like, oh, I just thought of this thing that I want our employee to know tomorrow, I'll just go on my phone to this Google Sheet and leave a note that's like, hey, for Brian's order, be sure to blah, blah, blah. And then the routine is they come in the morning, they look at the orders to do for the day, they look at this spreadsheet that's on our tablet and they see notes from me, they leave their initials that they've read it. So it's a good communication tool and a way that I can like immediately get an idea down without texting an employee when they're not working. So the first tab is my team updates tab. And then I have my shifts and payroll tab. So I have the next month, who's working what hours, the payroll dates, when they need to send me their hours. Then I have our tagging procedures. So tagging is so important when you're doing wash and fold because you don't want to mix orders up, right? So I have a very specific way that we tag things. And so I have a spreadsheet tab that breaks that down. I won't go into all the details about this, but if someone comes in and they have a foreign phone number, like a non-US phone number, it annoyingly doesn't work on the software that I use. So there's like a different procedure we have to use for that. So I have a breakdown of that. I have our cleaning schedule. I have a whole overview of our wash and fold procedures, our dry cleaning procedures, weekly orders and how those work, and then a weekly schedule. And then I guess I have one more that's just kind of like an other section for notes.
Real quick on, is this like an actual like Google Sheets or Microsoft Excel spreadsheet, or are you doing this actually in the software?
No, this is just a Google spreadsheet. And then on the tablet that we use, we've got like a few things there kind of ready to go, the Sense software, and then this spreadsheet. So, and again, this is all stuff like I didn't teach my employees by just saying, hey, read this spreadsheet, right? I think it's very important to teach actively, but this is just a good reference and a good way for me to communicate with them.
Yeah. I love that. So are they going like every day to start a shift? Are they clicking through the 9 tabs, or do they're checking that first one to get their updates and periodically checking the other ones? How does that work?
Yeah, so they're just checking the first tab daily. I mean, they might be looking at the others daily, but I've just asked them to look at the first team updates tab daily and to put their initials. And then the other ones are just there for reference. I want my employees to feel as much autonomy as possible because most of the time they're working there and I'm not there. Like I might see an employee maybe once a week, every couple weeks. And I do stay pretty accessible by phone. Like employees will text me occasionally or call me with questions, but I want them to have as much autonomy as possible. And so I think this is a good way for me to provide some extra support. And so they have something to refer to see if that can answer their question before they call me.
Yeah. All right. So we've got team updates, shifts and payroll, tagging orders. What do we got next?
Foreign customers.
Oh, the foreign customers.
There's a different procedure for that. Yeah. Our cleaning schedule, our wash and fold procedures, our dry cleaning, our weekly orders, our weekly schedule.
Awesome.
And then just an other tab with kind of like other notes that I keep, like when we had our main lines jetted, when I replaced a gas valve, things like that.
So those are more notes for you to keep track of.
Yeah.
Kind of routine maintenance type of stuff.
And I could be better about keeping a specific maintenance log. I think that's something that I could improve on. But yeah, that's what I've got in this tab right now. And I like having everything in one place. So I'm not like clicking 10 different places in my drive for it.
Yeah. I love that. I mean, I love having that there just right there on the, on the tablet that they're using for their software, the wash, dry, fold orders and all that stuff, and having that reference there makes it super clean, super easy, and everybody knows exactly where to go. It's all in one place. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. Did you start it from scratch or did you pick stuff from different places or what'd you do?
Yeah, no, I started it from scratch. I think that's something I learned teaching. There are, I'm sure, great resources out there, but something that I found teaching is sometimes when I would take someone else's template, it actually ended up being more work for me to adapt it into what would work for me. And if I have a specific vision about how I want something to be, I find it just easier to start it from scratch.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. Okay. So you have sort of put this thing together. It sounds like you've gone through a couple of employees trying to figure out, get a good fit. And then, just turnover happens at this wage rate a lot. And that's just part of the game. Do you feel like, a little over a year into your experience, how are you feeling? Are you feeling like this has been good? I've learned a lot. Are you feeling like I'm ready to tackle the whole earth? How are you feeling right now, just in terms of owning this business for a little over a year?
Yeah, good question. I feel great about this investment that we made. I think I said earlier, it's really felt like a real world MBA, and not to dismiss MBAs at all. I'm sure there's a ton of value that people get from them. But I do think that there is something particularly special and useful about actually doing the thing, actually running a business. And I've learned so much from that. And I'm really excited to buy a larger business one day. I think, what this has taught me is that I can do it. And if I hadn't bought this laundromat first, I don't think I would have just been like, oh, I could buy a $2 million business. I wouldn't have had the confidence and I wouldn't have had the capital for that probably at the time. But when we sell our laundromat, we're going to be selling for a profit and we're going to walk away with the cash to make a down payment on an SBA loan for, I just kind of throw 2 million out there. It might be a little more, it might be a little less. But I feel like we've really built the skills necessary to run a larger business. And I've really enjoyed running this laundromat. I will say, I don't want to do it for forever. And I think that's okay. There are, certain parts of my life that don't fit into this particular investment well. We live in Oakland, hitting traffic going into the city. It should be a 25 to 30 minute drive if there's no traffic, but that is not the reality of it. And so, I don't love the commute, especially if I do need to go in more than one day a week. That can be tough. And I do really think this business needs a local operator, and my husband and I would really like to travel for extended periods of time. We may end up moving to Southern California. So I don't think this business is going to be the best fit for me for forever. But during this time that I've owned it, I've learned so much and I've had the opportunity to really personally grow in ways that I wouldn't have without this. So I just feel like the experience that I've gained is really so much more valuable than the money that I've earned. And the business is profitable. I will say it's not my only source of income. Our SDE is around 80K. And if that were the only money I'm making, that would be tough in the Bay Area. And so I do like to be upfront with people about that, if you're buying one laundromat, I don't know if that can completely replace the income from your job. Depends on the laundromat. But yeah, I would say just the experience I've gained in and of itself has been incredibly valuable.
Real quick. Well, first of all, there are for sure laundromats that can, and also depending on what job you have and what income so you can.
Sure. Yeah, that's so true.
Sure. But in the Bay Area, it's a little tougher. But I'm glad to hear that, there's thoughts of coming to the light side down here in Southern California. You mentioned, I just want to, just so everybody's on the same page, you're talking about seller discretionary earning or SDE. Could you explain, you said 80K SDE. Could you explain what that is so we're all on the same page here?
Yeah, definitely. So seller discretionary earnings are a common way that businesses are valued, and you're typically going to see that more on the smaller side. Another common way businesses are measured is through EBITDA. That tends to be larger businesses. They're very similar. They have a couple differences, but they're essentially the same concept, which is basically, if you're looking at two businesses to buy, you want to be able to fairly compare them. And if you're just looking at the net income, that's not necessarily going to give you the most accurate view. Because, for example, if you have a loan on a business, you can legally write off those interest payments on the loan in order to reduce your taxable income. But you, as the new person coming in, you may not have a loan on the business, or you may have different terms. That expense that the business is writing off is not necessarily going to apply to you. So that's why we do things called add backs, where we add back a certain list of, like verified acceptable expenses in order to get to a seller's discretionary earnings. So for example, we do have a small interest payment on a loan for 2 machines that we have. So I take our net income and I add that interest payment back because that's not going to apply to a new buyer. You can also add back certain taxes and discretionary expenses. So for example, I pay for a bookkeeper. I was doing bookkeeping myself for a while, and honestly, I could still be doing it. I just didn't want to spend the time on it anymore. So I consider that a discretionary expense. It's not the same thing as utilities. You don't need a bookkeeping service in order to run the business. So I'm adding that back. So the SDE is the net income plus verified add backs pre-tax.
Awesome. I will say too, I look at hundreds of deals a week pretty much. And, just make sure the add backs are legitimate. I just see owners trying to add back all kinds of stuff.
Me too. Yeah.
The SBA side of things, you see that also.
Yeah. And I think that's something that, if you've never bought a business before, it's really important to understand how they're valuing it and make sure that you understand how those add backs work. And if, let's say you're coming from real estate, the way that real estate is valued is different than how businesses are valued. So just making sure you educate yourself and you ask for some type of breakdown. And I think that most sellers provide this, or most brokers provide like an SDE worksheet that's explaining how they got to the SDE, what they're adding back. And it's really important to look at that and understand how they're getting to that number, because most likely they're valuing the business off that number.
Yeah. I think most might be a little strong, but hopefully you can get an SDE worksheet from.
You should be. I believe best practice is to provide that. But
best practice,
that's my opinion.
Is good. Yeah. I think the state of our industry right now, specifically when it comes to selling and buying laundromats, it's not great. And a lot of sellers won't provide things like tax returns or bank statements, or they'll say, okay, I'll give them to you, but nudge, nudge, wink, wink, here's how much it really makes. Right. And which we talked about earlier. And so there's a lot of messiness in here. And I will just say, and as somebody who has experience here, it is really easy to go wrong buying a laundromat, particularly if you don't have good records like you're keeping, which is the case the vast majority of the time of deals that I see. There's not great records. So just tread carefully. That's all I guess I'm trying to say. I mean, you've mentioned real estate and businesses like a laundromat or maybe something else down the line. I guess you've kind of already tipped your hat in this direction already, but like real estate investing versus businesses, how do they compare, and which are you preferring right now, I guess?
Oh man, you will not catch me buying any real estate anytime soon. I can tell you that for sure. And look, there are people who are very successful in real estate. Obviously, I'm not saying that it's an investment strategy that doesn't work. However, I have just found, like you mentioned, we own a 4-unit building. We bought it in December of 2021, and then we own a business. And I'll say with the particular investments I have in my experience, I have found a lot more control in business acquisition than in real estate. Now, I will say it, that level of control does come generally with more work. I don't put 7 to 10 hours a week into managing my property. There have been times where it has caused a lot of stress and taken up a lot of my time. But I think, with business, because you are putting in effort, I think it has been a lot easier for me to actually see returns on that. So we bought our 4-unit building in 2021. We paid $1.45 million for it. it's now worth less. We had one realtor tell us it was worth 1.2. And that's not because of anything we've done. That's the market of the Bay Area. And the truth is, there's not a whole lot I can do to improve that value, right? Like there are certain things, if I were going to sell, if we had higher rents or something, like maybe an investor would take that into account. But when you just look at how real estate is valued, a lot of it is based on comps. What are other buildings of similar type selling for in this area? And I just don't have a control over market conditions, right? I also don't have a control over rental laws. And I want to be clear, I am pro tenants' rights. I am pro, I've been a renter in Oakland and I've had a shady landlord. Like I think there should be protections in place for people. Absolutely. But we ran into this really tough situation where we had a tenant. He actually came with the building from the previous seller, so I didn't select him. He stopped paying rent in December, and we were really trying to work with him to avoid the eviction process. And lesson learned is honestly maybe we should have started it sooner, because there were months he had been late, and I was like, I really want to work with this guy. I want to figure out if we can avoid evicting him. And it just didn't work out, unfortunately. And so it took until May for the eviction process to go through. And between the rent that we lost and ended up being quite a lot of money we had to put into cleaning the unit up because it was left in really terrible condition, it was like $25,000 total that we lost in that. And there were points in that where there's literally nothing we can do. I mean, we got an attorney, we did, followed the book. And there were times when it was just like, we're waiting to hear back from the courts, right? And it was really frustrating to not have that sense of control, especially when we were evicting for a just cause. It's like, you signed this lease, you agreed to pay this money. We've been trying to work with you. That's not working out. You're still not paying. And we're not going to get that money back. And so that was frustrating. Now, with a business, I'm not to say there aren't regulations in business. Obviously there are, but I think that I found it easier to respond to issues. If my utility costs go up, I can raise prices the next day, right? I have that ability. Now, whether or not that's a good idea would be another question, but like I can, and I have made small price increases over time, and actually no one has commented on it because they've been small enough that people don't really notice. But I found a lot more control in business acquisition and just a greater return on our investment. I mean, when we bought our 4-unit building, we put in about $400K cash to close. That could have been 2 laundromats, right? Like the amount of money that it took to buy a laundromat was $190,000. And when I think of both the money we've made and the experience that I've gained, I've found it to be a lot more valuable than real estate. Now, this really depends on the market you're in. You could buy in a place and you get lucky and the market goes up and it's a fantastic investment. But just speaking from my own experience, I found real estate to have less return on my investment, have more legal challenges, and overall just feel less sense of control.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, those are real, right? Those are like real life. And thank you, by the way, for sharing numbers. Cause that's always kind of helpful to do. I know sometimes it can be hard for people to share those numbers, but appreciate you sharing the numbers. And, you're right. I mean, I love the control that you have over business, right? Like if you need, for whatever reason, like you needed to drum up more business, you could decide, hey, we're gonna really ramp up our wash, dry, fold, and we're gonna go aggressive, literally knocking on doors. Like that's something that's free that you can do with your time. Like if you had to do it, you could go generate more income, right? You could add a pickup and delivery where you go out and drive. Like if you got in a corner, right, and you had to do something, like you said with the 4-unit, there's really not anything that you can do. You just kind of have to wait. I do want to point out just real quick, one little caveat, that the valuation of real estate is different when it's considered residential real estate, right? So 4 units or less. The valuation method actually becomes pretty similar when it's commercial real estate, actually. But 4 units or less is where there is a difference in how they're valued, and you don't really have a lot of control. And even in commercial, you have less control over commercial real estate than you do a business as well. There are things that you can do to force that appreciation sometimes in commercial real estate, but less so than if you have a business. It's easier to go drum up business, or I shouldn't say it's not easy, but you have the capability of drumming up business if you need it or you want it when you are running a business there.
And the other thing I'll say is the customer concentration, right? We have a 4-unit building, one tenant isn't paying. That's a much higher customer concentration. If I have a wash and fold customer who doesn't pay me, one, they're like one amongst many. And two, I can just not do their laundry again until they pay me. And maybe I'm out like $100, right? But it's a much smaller deal than not getting a rent check.
Yeah. It's not 25 grand. Although I will say, just for you specifically, is I had a condo in the Bay Area on the peninsula, and we bought it for what we thought was an astronomical price of $530,000. 2008 hit and it dropped and we were underwater. And 2 years later, we were relocating back to the promised land down here in Southern California and sold it for what we bought it for, $530,000. So it bounced back at least a little. And then 2 years later, it was worth 1.2 million. So who knows what that thing is going to be worth next week for you? It could be 700,000. It could be 6 million. We just don't know.
And I mean, that's the positive side of things, right? Is sometimes then the market works in your favor and you're like, I didn't have to do anything and it's just worth more. Yeah. And like I said, there are people who are very successful with real estate. Totally. In my experience, I'm buying another business.
Yeah. That's great. I mean, and that's kind of what goes back to like what we were talking about earlier, right? You like got to do some stuff to find your path, right? And you don't find your path by sitting here and thinking about your path for too long. You got to do that. You got to think about it and make good decisions, but you really only find your path after you start walking down it.
Absolutely. And like, I don't regret buying the property, right? Because, time will tell how this investment turns out. To your point, 5 years from now, it'll be worth a lot more. Like the plan is to hold it, right? It was a buy and hold. So I don't regret it, but I'm just using the information I've learned from the experience to guide me in my next step.
Yeah. That's great. I mean, that's a great mindset to have too. And it's hard to have when you're coming fresh off of a messy eviction and you're looking at Zillow and you're like, oh, dude, this is not what I was expecting. But kudos to you for having that. I got a couple other questions I want to ask before we wrap this thing up. Number one, I just thought, because you did it not that long ago for one, but also because of your being an SBA loan broker and seeing businesses and talking with people who are buying laundromats and that kind of stuff. Can we talk due diligence a little bit? We've talked about how hard that can be. But what have you learned about due diligence? What tips do you have?
Great question. I love talking about this. So, I talk to a lot of people who want to buy laundromats and have one-on-one conversations with people, and a lot of people want to know about my laundromat. And I'm a very open book, as you can see. I talk about financials, I talk about operations. So I'm basically like, ask me anything about my laundromat. And I think it's like a good practice for people who want to do due diligence to be like, okay, let me practice asking questions to a current laundromat owner. And I feel like a lot of people overlook some really important things in laundromat due diligence and are focused on some things that I think are less important. And it was interesting. In 2 calls I had this week with people who are interested in laundromats, the first question each of them asked me was, how many machines do you have?
I get that so much. I'm like, I don't even know how many machines I have.
It honestly takes me a second to answer. I'm like 5, 6, 7, 13. Okay. Yeah. I think, like, I'm not saying you shouldn't know about the machines. If you're buying a laundromat, you should have an equipment list with age of the machines. You should do due diligence on them. I'm not saying don't ask about that, but I think there are a lot more important questions to ask than how many machines do you have. I think the 2 biggest areas that I see people overlooking, and I want to say up front, like, obviously you should look at P&Ls. Obviously you should verify revenue. Like that, I feel like goes without being said. And not to say there's not nuance to that, but I think what people are missing is 2 things. And that's one, the seller. What is the seller's vibe? And I know that might seem like a silly thing in the context of a very official business transaction, but I think that it's really an overlooked component, because in the due diligence process, if you are working with someone who doesn't have good intentions, it's possible they're going to hide something from you, right? And either they may be successful in hiding that, you don't find out until much later, or you get a month or two into due diligence, you find it out, and now you back out of the deal, but you've maybe lost out on some due diligence costs. You've lost out on your time. You could have been pursuing another acquisition, right? And I think that, I'm not saying you need to go out there and do a background check on the seller, but I think something I picked up from teaching is I feel like I can get a pretty good read on people. Like when someone is being transparent, when someone is being forthright with information, when someone is being responsive, I pick up on those things and I'm like, okay, you seem like you're a trustworthy person, right? And if I were buying another laundromat or really any business, if someone was not responsive, if they were not, willing to share information, if they weren't willing to tell me the problems of their business, those would raise red flags for me. And even if the business looked great on paper, I would really think twice about buying it, because you can't do a good deal with a bad actor, right? There's only so much you can find out during due diligence. You're never going to know 100% what it's like to run a business until you buy it. And I think you really need to develop trust and rapport with the seller. So that's the first thing I think people are overlooking is, what is the seller like? What is your relationship with them? The second thing that I think people are overlooking is just the operations of the business. And I think the question really is, what are the problems of this specific business and how will I address them? And really, how am I going to operate it day to day? A lot of people ask me questions about my machines. They ask me questions about my utility bills. And again, I'm not saying don't ask those questions, but a much better question to ask would be like, how much capacity do you think your machines have? If you wanted to grow your wash and fold service, is there the space to do that, right? Is there enough downtime in your machines that you could grow it? Another great question to ask, tell me 3 problems you've dealt with in the last month as an owner. If someone can't tell you 3 problems they've dealt with in their business, they're lying to you. Every business has problems. I can think of 5 that I've dealt with in the last month. And not that they're anything like terrible or significant, but it's like little things come up. And I think people really overlook that. And, when I talk to people who want to buy laundromats, I'll be like, okay, you have a full-time job. What's your plan for if a problem comes up on a Tuesday? And they'll be like, oh, I'm going to have the employee deal with that. Like, okay, what if your employee can't fix it? I'm going to have a manager deal with it. And I'm not saying don't delegate. You have to delegate. As a business owner, you can't be doing everything all the time, right? But I think if you are going into it with this mindset of, I'm going to have other people fix my problems, I don't think that's the best mindset to have. If you're buying one laundromat, first off, I think it's less likely that you're going to be able to afford a manager. If you have a portfolio, that changes it, right? But basically having someone like on call for all hours that your laundromat is open to deal with problems, if you want to be a responsive owner, it's tough to find the cash flow for a high quality manager. But 2, again, I just think there's this mindset where if you're not thinking through like, okay, if an employee calls out on a Tuesday and I'm at work, what's my plan for how to address that? Like, I think you're going to run into a lot of problems when you buy it. So seller, you need to consider them, their personality, how well you work together, and also day-to-day operations. I think it's a lot more important to ask questions about that and the problems the current owner has faced than the machines, right? How does your pickup and delivery system work? What happens if a driver doesn't show up? What do you do? How do you train your employees? What are issues that you see customers having and how do you respond to them? Like, how is this specific laundromat, because every laundromat is different, how is this specific laundromat going to fit into your life as it is? Will you need to make any changes in your life, right? Like, I chose to leave my job. I'm really happy with that decision. Some people might choose to keep their job. great. But you are going to think about, like, you said buying laundromat is kind of like having a baby. I don't have any kids yet, so I can't personally say, but I have thought that before, right? I've been like, this is great preparation for having a baby, because it's like, okay, who's going to watch the laundromat right now? Like, who's going to deal with this problem? And so I think you have to recognize, like, it is a significant investment to make. Your life is going to have to change if you want to do well at this, and just being realistic about what you are and aren't willing to do.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, cracking me up. I was like literally laughing when you were like, people ask me how many machines I have, and I'm like, people are so obsessed with number of machines.
Yeah.
Like, people are like, is this good or bad? There's 42 machines. And I'm like, I don't even know what size space 42 machines would fit in.
I am going to just hot take. The number of machines doesn't matter. And here's why I say it doesn't matter. The revenue matters, and the amount the machines are being used matters. If the machines are literally running all day, right, then that tells you your revenue is pretty maxed out, unless you raise prices, right? But you can't like grow your wash and fold or add a wash and fold if the machines are maxed out. But it doesn't really matter like the number of machines. You should understand how often they're being used generally, and you should understand the revenue. But yeah, I don't really understand why people are so stuck on the number. I think they've probably seen some YouTube videos that tell them that's important.
Yeah, my camera just shut off. I don't know, but we'll keep rolling with it. But I agree. Like, it just cracked me up that you hear that all the time too.
Yeah.
I feel like, even though the camera's out, I feel like we would really be missing out here if we didn't talk financing for a second. That's really one of the biggest obstacles to overcome for a lot of people, of how do you actually buy these things. So can you talk, I mean, you utilize some private funding, which is great. And I don't know, maybe you could share a little bit of your experience about that, what that was like, how that was. But also obviously SBA is a potential financing tool. So maybe you could talk about SBA in the context of laundromats, because there's some challenges with that as well, but some also great opportunities.
Definitely. So I'll say, I was in a very privileged position to be able to get a loan from a family member. Not everyone has that opportunity. So I feel very fortunate that that opportunity was available to me. If not, we would have explored SBA. But like I said, I don't think it would have worked with the particular laundromat that we ended up buying. But I will say, like, if that is an opportunity available to you, I would definitely explore it and see, who is willing to invest in you out of the people that you know. You can also definitely use an SBA loan to buy a laundromat. Like you said, there are some challenges to it. And I think the number one challenge that I've seen is the cash nature of the business. Either so much of it is cash that it becomes difficult to verify, or owners are underreporting. And that's an unfortunate reality when owners don't prepare to sell. So, I mean, that can be the case with a lot of small businesses, not just laundromats, right? But I think those are the issues you run into. And, you mentioned earlier, it can be hard to get documents. And I'm always surprised, because my opinion is, if you've signed an NDA, I'll give you my tax returns, right? If you want to redact your social security number or whatever, fine. But I feel like if you sign an NDA, you can see everything. You don't have to submit an offer before you can see my utility bills and my tax returns. But a lot of brokers and sellers wait until an offer is signed to share some of the most important documents. But if you can get a hold of those tax returns, compare them to the P&L, specifically the revenue and the expenses. Are they matching up, right? And if they're not, that could cause an issue. Now, if they're a legitimate ad backs, that's a different story. But like you said, we see some wacky ad backs out there, people who are, brokering loans and selling businesses. So comparing those documents is important. With an SBA loan, I think something that's great about it is it can have a very favorable structure. So you may only need to come in with 10% cash injection. It does depend on the cash flow. And I do see, a recent change that was made to SBA that a lot of people are excited about is technically you can source the cash injection from a seller note, right? So you can come in with 0% down. And I see people advertising this on YouTube, but I'll say in my experience, not every lender is willing to do this, right? And typically when lenders are doing that, it's because the buyer has direct industry experience. It's not a deal they're going to offer to everyone. So I just want to set realistic expectations for that. If you don't have any experience in the industry, it's more likely you're going to need to come with 10% down or maybe a 5-5 split. You come in with 5%, 5% seller note. I think it's very reasonable to ask for a small seller note in any business acquisition. 5% is pretty common for SBA. Of course, it is possible to get 100% seller financing. And that's something else that I see a lot on YouTube, like how to buy a laundromat with $0. And are there people who have done it? I'm sure there are people who have done it. Is it the norm? And should you expect that? I don't know about that. Typically, sellers want to have some level of cash walking away from the deal, right? They may not, want to wait 5 to 7 to 10 years to get paid back. So involving some level of seller financing is smart, and you can always negotiate for that. But I think it's reasonable to expect 10% down. Another option that I'll give, though, a good non-SBA alternative is a personal unsecured loan. Now, these are more expensive. So for example, the lender I work with, interest rates are like 9 to 15%, which is more expensive than SBA. SBA, prime plus, if it's a really good deal, maybe 1, more likely prime plus 2 to maybe 3, right? So it's more expensive and there is usually a fee after. But the great thing about these is that there are lenders who will offer an unrestricted use of funds, meaning you can do whatever you want with the money. And because it's a personal loan, they're not looking at the business. They're looking at your personal income, your expenses, your DTI, your debt to income ratio. Now, what I will say, though, is that if you are using a personal loan because SBA is not a good fit for you, you just need to ask yourself why SBA is not a good fit. Because let's say SBA isn't a good fit because lenders are like, P&Ls don't match the tax returns. We can't get comfortable with the revenue, right? Now, if that's the case, I wouldn't recommend just rushing and being like, great, I'm just going to get a personal loan because I want to get the deal done, right? Like, you need to find a way to get comfortable with that revenue yourself. But let's say, I don't know, let's say like you've got a family friend who's selling a laundromat and for some reason it doesn't appeal to SBA lenders, but you're like, I can get behind this. I trust this person. I've been able to verify the revenue, but there's some reason it doesn't work for SBA and I'm okay with that reason. Then I think a personal loan could be a good way to circumvent that, because they're not going to look at the business financials, right? So whatever concern an SBA lender has isn't necessarily going to apply if it's specifically about the business. Now, you do need to have the debt to income ratio to make that work. And you shouldn't ignore what SBA lenders are telling you if they have concerns. You should think about that and be like, okay, this is what they're telling me. Can I get comfortable with that problem? And if you can, then that's a good option. You can also do 401k rollovers. To be honest, I don't really do those as much. I work with an organization that does, but you can take retirement funds and use them to buy a business. So yeah, those are a few of the financing options.
Yeah. And so thank you for sharing all that. I mean, that's already like a lot of tools in the tool belt to help people buy, but really you're only limited by your own drive and your own creativity when it comes to financing any business or any investment. Really, there, like I said earlier, there's a lot of money out. Like it's crazy how much money is out there. Go on here. I did this the other day, just randomly. I was on Zillow. I'm always like looking for, I don't know. I don't even know what I'm looking for. But anyways, I was on there and I was like, I wonder how many $10 million plus houses are in a state like Arkansas. And there's a lot of $10 million houses in Arkansas. And you don't think of that in Arkansas. It just shows you like there's so much money out there. And a lot of times people are just looking for places to put it to generate a return, a pretty safe return at that. And you can find that money if you are driven, even if for whatever reason you can't qualify for an SBA loan or whatever. But I love your caveat of like, if a lender is telling you no, take that seriously. It doesn't mean the lender's always right. And I found that lenders tend to be very conservative a lot of times, which is not a bad thing. And they're just protecting their assets and you need to protect your assets too. But that doesn't mean they're always right. So if you hit a brick wall one way, that doesn't mean stop. It means overcome the obstacle if there's an opportunity there to do so.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, Kiera, this has been awesome. I want to, first of all, thank you again for coming on and making time. And even, after you hit your obstacle of the employee calling out and having to reschedule, overcoming that obstacle and being here today and sharing so much there. I want to give you an opportunity, though, one more time to, number one, let people know how they can connect with you, whether they want to talk shop with you, talk laundromats with you, they just want to kind of network with you, or if they're looking for SBA options and they need to talk to somebody who's knowledgeable about SBA and laundromats, what's the best way they can get in touch with you?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first off, Jordan, I want to say just thank you so much for having me on. I've really enjoyed this conversation. And one of the reasons I started creating content recently and going on podcasts like this is I really want more people to see business acquisition as a possibility for them. Not to say that it is what everyone should do with their life, right? It's not the best fit for everyone. But as someone who never thought I was going to own a business, right? Who thought I was going to be a high school English teacher for forever, I am living such an unexpected and wonderful life. And I want to show other people what possibilities there are. Not to say that it's easy. I am not one of those people you will find on YouTube talking about passive income and buying a laundromat for $0, right? Like there are obstacles. It's challenging, but I want to show people how to get through those obstacles and realistic ways that you can move in this world. So I really appreciate having the platform to educate people and share my experience. And if I can be helpful to anyone in any way, I definitely want to do that, especially people who are making a career change or who don't come from a business background, don't see themselves as business people. I've really had a whole journey with that myself. And if you'd like to connect with me, LinkedIn is a great way to do it. Kiera Hamilton, Kiera spelled Keira, or YouTube, Kiera_Hamilton. I've got a 3-part series on YouTube on how to buy a business, and it is directed towards people who have not owned a business before, maybe who have never thought about buying a business. So it's really an introductory course. I've also got some more laundromat content on there. And like you mentioned, I also broker SBA loans. And something that people don't know about SBA loan brokering, this might not be the case for all SBA lenders, all SBA brokers. But basically how it works is I work with people who are looking to buy a business and I connect them with a variety of lenders. So I have a wide network of SBA lenders. But the cool news for my clients is that I'm paid directly by lenders at close. So there's actually no fee to a client to utilize my services. It's essentially free services to get your SBA deal shopped around and to find the best option for you. I love working with people for whom it's their first time buying a business, people from unconventional backgrounds. So if you're listening and you're interested in buying a business, definitely reach out. LinkedIn is a great way to find me.
And real quick, one last time, go subscribe to her YouTube for one, and go connect with her on LinkedIn. But last time, what is the name of the podcast that you got out there?
Yes. So you want to buy a business? You can find it on my YouTube channel and on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. It focuses on the ETA journey, entrepreneurship through acquisition. So people who have bought businesses or people involved in the business buying process.
Awesome. All right. Go check out Kiera and all of her stuff. She is rocking it over there. And Kiera, thank you again for coming on. And thank you for being so open and transparent with your journey and your story and your numbers and all of the above in your experience in this business. I appreciate it a lot. I know a ton of people are going to love this episode and love hearing from you and want to connect with you. So hopefully you don't get too bombarded by fans. But I appreciate you coming on. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was great.
All right. Hope you loved that. I don't even hope. I know you loved that interview with Kiera. She is great. She brought just so much good stuff today. Like I said, instant classic episode right there. So your challenge for today is to pick something from this episode and put it into practice. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. There was so much good stuff in there. It's going to be tough to pick one thing. If you can do more than one thing, do more than one thing. But one is the standard, the minimum, the bare minimum. Do one thing this week. Put it into action. That's going to help you propel you towards your goals. So huge shout out and thank you to Kiera for coming on the show, sharing so much good stuff, helping us all out in our next phase of wherever we're at in our journey. in life here. And hey, check out the news episode coming out on Friday, and every Friday is brand new. We just launched our last one this last Friday, our first one this last Friday, and those are ongoing. And also, if you're listening to this and you have some news that's relevant to this industry, whether you are a vendor or an owner, hey, send me an email, news@laundromatresource.com, and we will get that featured in the news episode. All right. All right. We'll see you next week. Actually, we'll see you on Friday before next week for the news episode. Peace.